evening. I'm Sarah Watson. Welcome to tonight's show, the 1875 Emancipation Celebration. This is part of our series called Looking for Lincoln Conversations. For more information about the Looking for Lincoln Conversations, you can visit our Facebook page, Looking for Lincoln's Facebook page. Sam Wheeler and Heather Feezor will discuss this event in context with other similar events that celebrated and/or commemorated the Emancipation Proclamation. They will also show the new mini documentary that Looking for Lincoln created about the event, and will share a little bit about how it was created. Sam Wheeler is the Director of History Programs for the Illinois Supreme Court Historic Preservation Commission, and he also served on the committee that helped create the documentary. Heather Feezor is the program manager for Looking for Lincoln and the Abraham Lincoln National Heritage Area. Heather, it's my pleasure to introduce you first.
Thank you, Sarah. And we are very excited tonight to share this episode with you. But before we do, I wanted to provide a little context on how the episode came about in the sense of where did the idea come from? And I want to talk a little bit about how we moved to virtual programming. So during the pandemic, we couldn't do live programming. So we had to do digital, which is where Looking for Lincoln Conversations came about. And one day we were talking about stories we could tell in the communities and our Looking for Lincoln communities, and how we could tell them to a broader audience in addition to Looking for Lincoln Conversations. And we had an idea to create a series called Looking for Lincoln Stories that would highlight stories that happened in Lincoln's life and times within what we call the Abraham Lincoln National Heritage Area. And we just didn't want to tell just stories. We were really looking to tell stories connected that were unknown, like women's stories, stories from African Americans. So we got a committee together, of which Sam served on, and we helped create this event, or I should say the series of videos. And this is the very first one we ever created. And so Looking for Lincoln Stories is a video, and it's also a podcast series. And the episodes use music, sound effects, and images to tell compelling stories. And this is a multifaceted project, which includes research, community collaboration, script development, and production of both the videos and podcasts. So our goal in doing this is really to bring unknown and little-known stories to the public in engaging ways that can be then used by our communities to enhance the stories they're able to tell in their communities. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to bring Sam Wheeler on, and he's going to provide some context to kind of set the 1875 Emancipation Celebration into context about what was going on in the country at that time, but then also some other events that were happening around Central Illinois. Hi, Sam.
Hey, good to see you, Heather.
Good to see you.
Thank you so much for inviting me on today to offer some insights about today's video. Before I start, I just want to say congratulations to everybody. Everybody that was involved with the making of this video, Looking for Lincoln. This is a big accomplishment. And a video series is a great way to get some of these stories out into the world. And tonight's story is a really interesting one. September 22nd, 1875, a big celebration took place in Atlanta, Illinois, here in Logan County. Maybe 1,200 people turned out to this event. White and black citizens from Central Illinois gathered together for what they called a Grand Old-Style Barbecue, featuring good food, lots of speakers. There were 15 scheduled individuals to speak that day in Atlanta. The main speaker was Shelby Cullom. He was a staunch Republican who knew Lincoln very well. He was a member of the Illinois legislature before the Civil War, during the Civil War, and after the Civil War. He had served in the United States Congress, and he was getting ready to run for governor of Illinois, and he would be elected governor in 1876. Why did everybody get together that day in Atlanta? They came together to celebrate the anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, issued September 22nd, 1862. There's probably more to the story of that event, but in a nutshell, that's what was happening in Atlanta in 1875. Heather asked me to speak a little bit about putting that story into context before we watch the video. I guess I'll start by saying that a celebration marking the end of slavery wasn't unusual at all in America. Even before the Civil War, during a time when slavery was still a thriving institution in America, there were actually Emancipation Day celebrations. Those Emancipation Day celebrations took place on August 1st. They were recognizing the moment when the British Empire passed the Slavery Abolition Act, ending slavery in the Caribbean on August 1st, 1838. Emancipation Day celebrations then that took place in America before the American Civil War were usually held on August 1st. Those were days when Black and white citizens came together, they shared food, they celebrated the moment when slavery ended at a specific spot on the globe in the Caribbean. Speakers interpreted the meaning of freedom, and they usually reflected on all the work that was yet to be done in America, because again, America still was a place where slavery was thriving. In New England, before the American Civil War, Emancipation Day celebrations took place on August 1st. Abolitionist speakers were featured, but again, Black and white audiences came together on these dates. Illinois was no exception. A quick search of Illinois newspapers found Emancipation Day celebrations taking place in Illinois in 1857 in Chicago, again in 1858 and 1860. And again, before the Civil War, August 1st was a day to celebrate emancipation, putting slavery in a larger global context. Then the war came. Abraham Lincoln was elected to office in 1860. Secession occurred because Southern states feared the Republican Party would attack slavery. The first 18 months of the American Civil War, Lincoln fought very much a conservative war, a war to save the Union. He was careful not to touch slavery because he feared losing the border states. The border states hadn't seceded yet. He feared if there was a movement against slavery during the war, the border states would join the rebellion. He also worried about losing Northern support. Hundreds of thousands of Republicans and Democrats volunteered to save the Union. He worried that that popular sentiment wouldn't be there if there was a war to end slavery. But the conservative war to save the Union that had been fought the first 18 months of the conflict didn't lead to victory. More radical measures were needed. In many respects, enslaved people themselves led the charge toward emancipation. From the start of the war, enslaved people fled plantations and they went to Union lines. They forced the Union military to form a policy about what to do with slaves during the war. Union military commanders in the field were forced to make decisions about what to do with those escaping slaves. They decided to put them to work, deny the rebels their labor supply, and use the labor supply for their own benefit. The United States Congress, at the same time, was no longer weighed down by Southern members. Those Southern members of Congress, when Southern states seceded, they didn't participate in the United States Congress. As a result, Congress embraced emancipation early in the Civil War. They passed legislation. They sustained those military officers in the field that extended a hand to enslaved folks. They even made it illegal for Union officers to return runaway slaves to their owners. On April 16th, 1862, the United States Congress passed a bill abolishing slavery in the District of Columbia, the nation's capital. It was an abolitionist dream for decades. This was compensated emancipation. They reimbursed slave owners for their loss. It's the only such example of successful compensated emancipation in United States history. But as a result, as of April 16th, 1862, about 3,100 enslaved men, women, and children were free. April 16th was forever known afterwards as Emancipation Day in Washington, D.C. It continues to be celebrated as such today. That becomes another day to celebrate emancipation, along with August 1st. In the summer of 1862, Abraham Lincoln told his cabinet that he was going to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. His cabinet, most of those members, were shocked at his decision. They were shocked because what about the border states? What about Northern public opinion? Lincoln believed that slavery was at the heart of secession, and attacking slavery would be the key to ending the rebellion. His cabinet cautioned him about the timing behind issuing an Emancipation Proclamation. They told him that such a measure would be controversial, and it could be seen by some as a desperate measure. And so they advised him to wait until a major Union victory for him to issue such a proclamation. In September of 1862, Robert E. Lee invaded the North. The Union Army confronted them in Maryland, and on September 17, 1862, the Battle of Antietam occurred. Still today, it's considered the bloodiest day in American history. More than 22,000 casualties. It wasn't a glorious Union victory, but what it did do was it was basically a tactical draw. And at the end of the Battle of Antietam, the significant point was Robert E. Lee stopped his invasion of the North, turned around, and took his rebel soldiers back south. 5 days later, September 22nd, 1862, Abraham Lincoln issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It is one of the most misunderstood documents in American history. So what was it? It's an executive order issued by the President of the United States during the war. It wasn't a piece of legislation that was passed by Congress. Lincoln relied on his power as commander-in-chief to issue the document. In peacetime, Lincoln believed the president didn't have the power to suddenly declare slaves were free anywhere in the country, but this wasn't peacetime. There was a rebellion taking place, and the Constitution declared that the president was commander-in-chief of the military. So the Emancipation Proclamation, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln issued on September 22nd, was issued due to military necessity. It was issued to put down the rebellion. It did not declare that all the slaves in America were suddenly free. It only applied to those states or portions of states that were actively engaging in the rebellion. So about 3.5 million of the nation's 4 million slaves were affected by the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It did not apply to the border states. The border states are not actively in rebellion, and so technically they can keep slavery within their borders. It didn't apply to areas that were already under Union control. So at this point, portions of Louisiana, for instance, or Tennessee were exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation. And it didn't technically go into effect on September 22nd. The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation offered the Confederacy a timeline. Lincoln said in this document, you have 100 days to put down your arms, stop the rebellion, and come back into the Union. 100 days from September 22nd would be January 1st, 1863. Lincoln said if you put down your arms before January 1st, you re-enter the Union, keep your slaves, we save the Union, we continue on business as usual. If you don't, then your slaves are free. I can't overestimate that the Emancipation Proclamation was a controversial decision, and it took political and moral courage on Abraham Lincoln's part. We know how the story turned out today, but remember, none of that was a certainty in 1862 when Lincoln issued that document. It wasn't a overwhelmingly popular move to issue this document when Lincoln did so. Yes, abolitionists cheered it, but they're a small minority in the North. There's some military-minded folks that understand the military necessity. That was the military strategy behind Lincoln's decision. But many Northerners were irate when they read the news of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. They wanted to save the Union, but they didn't want to fight a war to end slavery. We can't underestimate the inherent racism that is a part of the Northern population in 1862. When the midterm elections occurred in 1862, Republicans suffered losses at the polls. It wasn't just because of the Emancipation Proclamation, but that certainly didn't help their polling results. After the war, September 22nd becomes another Emancipation Day to be celebrated, along with August 1st, along with April 16th. September 22nd is another date that communities used to celebrate Emancipation Day. September 22nd is a little different because that is a date that highlighted Lincoln's unique role in the road towards emancipation. So January 1st, 1863 comes. That night, New Year's Eve, 1863, there were watch parties that took place all across the United States. That 100-day window had expired. No Confederate state put down their arms. And so the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect January 1st, 1863. Lincoln signed the final version of the Emancipation Proclamation. And the final version went even further than the preliminary version. Lincoln inserted language into the final draft where he declared that slaves were not only free, but it allowed African Americans to serve in the Union Army. Before the war was over, more than 190,000 African Americans served in Union forces. 75% of those soldiers were former slaves. January 1st then becomes another Emancipation Day to be celebrated. Northern abolitionists, for instance, were ecstatic about the Emancipation Proclamation. That's going to be a date that in the decades after the Civil War, they will choose to celebrate emancipation. As the war continues, there's more Emancipation Days that become added to the list to celebrate. The Emancipation Proclamation, when it went into effect, slave owners didn't immediately free their slaves, obviously. They didn't recognize Abraham Lincoln's authority to issue such a document, and so business as usual went on in those communities. But what the Emancipation Proclamation did do was it transformed the Union Army into an army of liberation. As the Army moved further south into Confederate territory, enslaved people seized their opportunity. They ran away from their plantations, they seized their freedom, and they went to the Union lines. Individuals would remember the date that they did so, that they for decades afterwards, they would celebrate their personal emancipation days when they seized their freedom in the Union lines. The Union Army got Southern states under control at different times, different dates during the Civil War. They were able to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation at different dates in different communities. And so Southern states have many different dates in which they celebrate emancipation. Some of those dates are still celebrated today in those local communities. In many places in the South, it took years for the Emancipation Proclamation to be enforced. Richmond, Virginia is a really good example. It doesn't fall until April 3rd, 1865. For years afterwards, freedmen in Virginia celebrated Emancipation Day on April 3rd. That was the day when emancipation became meaningful in their community. After the Civil War, Emancipation Day celebrations continue. But there are a number of different dates to celebrate, as we've seen, depending on which part of the country that you're in. And I would argue that the day you choose to celebrate emancipation says a lot about who was organizing the celebration and what type of a celebration was taking place. So, for instance, August 1st continues to be a day of celebration. It marks the end of slavery in the British West Indies and the Caribbean. Abolitionists, white and black, before the Civil War celebrated it. After the Civil War, they continue to mark that date as a day to celebrate emancipation. It connects the experience in the British West Indies with the slavery experience in the United States. Slavery's over in both places. There's work to be done so we can all fully experience the meaning of freedom in our communities. It links the American experience with that global experience of slavery. April 16th continued to be a day to celebrate in Washington, D.C. It's sort of a legislative end to the saga of slavery. January 1st continued to be a day to celebrate the end of slavery, marking the final version of the Emancipation Proclamation. That's a date that embraced by many Northern abolitionists, both white and black. It culminated in decades worth of their effort to end slavery in the United States. And then, of course, there's those individual Emancipation Day dates in Southern states that commemorate the moment when the Union Army came into Southern states to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. And those are different dates depending on the states. I think the one that we're most familiar with is Texas. On June 19th, 1865, 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, 2 months after the Lincoln assassination, the Civil War is over. The Union Army finally made their way into Texas, into Galveston. And Union General Gordon Granger informed slaves that the Union Army was in control and they were now free. That date, June 19th, was celebrated for the next century and a half, continues to be celebrated, known as Juneteenth. Those individual Emancipation Day dates were originally celebrated locally, but in the 20th century, when the Great Migration occurred and African Americans began moving from the South into the North to cities like Chicago, they took local traditions with them. Days like their Emancipation Day celebrations on Juneteenth, and those local traditions caught on in communities around the country. Juneteenth is most famous because now it's a national holiday that was recently signed into federal law by Joe Biden. September 22nd, Emancipation Day celebrations often occur on September 22nd. That date is significant because those celebrations commemorate Lincoln's role in issuing the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Those celebrations, oftentimes, when you read about them in newspapers, are very Lincoln-centric events. Lincoln is long dead. He's not an active participant in the flesh, but his memory is very much alive in those events. Those events celebrate his political courage. That's important to recognize. Those events celebrate the Lincoln legacy, but also, and particularly in the years after the Civil War in the 19th century, those events were also very partisan events. They're an example of politicians getting right with Lincoln. They're usually Republican events. They feature speakers who are Republican, politicians that are running for some office on the Republican ticket. Those speakers praise Lincoln's leadership during the Civil War, and they remind voters in the crowd that they too, their policies are in lockstep with the Lincoln legacy. And the implication is you should vote the Republican ticket because they continue to be the party of Abraham Lincoln. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, crowds that attended those Emancipation Day events on September 22nd are white and black. Usually everybody in the crowd is a Republican voter. Democrats usually stay away from those events because there's going to be lots of things said by the speakers that day that they don't necessarily agree with. Springfield, Illinois is a place that held Emancipation Day celebrations after the Civil War on September 22nd, highlighting their connection with Abraham Lincoln. Local newspapers showed such events in 1867 and September 22nd, 1868. Springfield actually invited Frederick Douglass to be a speaker at one of these events, as well as Shelby Cullom and John Palmer. The Democrat newspaper at the time in 68 viciously condemned the events that were taking place. The commentary from the Democrat paper was just blatantly racist in their coverage. September 22nd, 1869 in Springfield, that was an event that I found the best newspaper coverage for. And I love that newspaper coverage because it gives the most detailed sort of an outline of events for a Emancipation Day celebration on September 22nd. Very quickly, the day would begin with a national salute fired at 5 a.m. At 10 o'clock, a parade began at the Baptist Church in Springfield, led by Rogers Cornet Band, a brass band. They marched to the Lincoln Home. They passed the governor's mansion. They marched to Oak Ridge Cemetery in the city park where they had lunch, and then they listened to speakers. The first speaker that day was George Brentz, an elder of the African Baptist Church. He was followed by John Palmer, who was the governor of Illinois. The newspaper went on to give a synopsis of what Palmer had to say. He celebrated Lincoln's role in saving the Union and ending slavery, speaking about the Lincoln's legacy. And then Palmer spoke directly about the 14th Amendment to the Constitution that had been ratified in July the previous year, that gave citizenship to African Americans. And then Palmer talked about the importance of ratifying the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which gave voting rights to African Americans. African Americans will become, by and large, overwhelmingly Republican voters. He talked about how important it was to ratify that amendment. It would be ratified in early 1870. The last speaker was Shelby Cullom. He gave memories of Abraham Lincoln. He put Lincoln's emancipation policy into context, talked about what political courage it took for Lincoln to soldier on. And he gave a really patronizing assessment to us today in terms of the progress of Black Americans from slavery to freedom. But Cullom was using Lincoln's legacy to hold, in essence, a Republican campaign rally. Similar events happened in 71 and again in 1876, just in advance of the most contentious election of the election of 1876. So that's the context for what we're about to see for the Emancipation Day celebration in Atlanta in 1875. On September 22nd, 1875, white and Black citizens came together to celebrate Lincoln's preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And I would just encourage you to think about some of that context of a partisan rally, Republican rally. In 1875, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution had been ratified. Black citizens Black men that are in the crowd have earned the right to vote, and they will vote overwhelmingly Republican. The speakers that day are Republicans. Shelby Cullom was a speaker, just like he had been in Springfield. He was really the main speaker that day in Atlanta. In September of 1875, he was getting ready to announce that he was going to be the Republican candidate for governor of Illinois. He will be elected governor in 1876. We don't have a transcript of what Cullom had to say that day in Atlanta, but I bet you anything, he would have reminded the crowd, reminded Republican voters that he had a close relationship with Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's policies are his policies. It would have been some sort of a campaign speech to encourage you to stay true to the Republican ticket and vote for him in the upcoming election. If Democrats attended that day in Atlanta, they probably wouldn't have agreed with a lot of the things that they heard from the speaker's podium, and it might explain some of the fisticuffs that even happened that the video makes reference to. I'm sure it had a partisan bend to it. So with all that being said, that's a little bit of context for what we're going to see here. In this video, 1875 Emancipation Day celebration, a Grand Old-Style Barbecue in Atlanta, Illinois. Here's the debut. We'll watch the video, and when it's over, Heather and I will chat for a moment, and we're happy to take your questions. Enjoy.
September 22nd, 1875 was a big day for the Logan County, Illinois community of Atlanta. According to the newspaper account at the time, footsteps were heard on the walks before daylight and kept up until a late hour next night. Huge fires were built. Trains brought carloads of visitors who joined as more than 1,000 at the town's fairgrounds. Were fired the first thing in the morning to alert everyone that the day that they had been waiting for had arrived. The people had gathered for a grand old-style barbecue with lots of good food, prominent speakers, music, and dancing. But the cause for the celebration is something we seldom think about today. The celebrants, half of them black and half of them white, were there to commemorate the 12th of the Emancipation Proclamation. Abraham Lincoln's desire to free the slaves in the Confederacy during the Civil War is universally accepted today. Who wouldn't support freeing millions of people who had been held in bondage for hundreds of years in the land of the free? Yet, the January 1st, 1863 issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation was the most radical departure from existing United States policy that the young nation had ever seen. Atlanta was a frequent stop for Abraham Lincoln long before he became president. He traveled as a lawyer on the 8th Judicial Circuit, and the townspeople were drawn to the tall, awkward, but eloquent Lincoln as he argued cases in court or told hilarious stories by firelight in the homes and inns of Atlanta. On one of his last visits to the community, Lincoln reportedly practiced his speech for one of his famous debates with Stephen A. Douglas in the office of an Atlanta community leader. So, when Lincoln told the world about his intent to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, the people of Atlanta undoubtedly took note. The Emancipation Proclamation's meaning wasn't lost on those it impacted the most. For enslaved Americans who had endured centuries of forced labor, it meant their own Independence Day. September 22nd, 1862 was the date that President Lincoln first announced his intention to issue the proclamation. And for many years after the Civil War, that day became an occasion for celebration. African Americans, often joined by their white fellow citizens, came together to commemorate that crucial first step on the road to freedom. Likewise, the January 1st, 1863 effective date of the proclamation became a day to commemorate. The date of June 19th, now known as Juneteenth, continues to be commemorated as the date the last slaves in the former Confederate States were freed in 1865. The September 22nd, 1875 Atlanta celebration was part of this larger commemorative impulse in the country to mark the end of slavery. Atlanta was home to a number of African American residents in 1875, many of whom had been born in free states, but some of whom came to the community with returning Union soldiers after the Civil War. The 1870 census showed 6 black households with a total of 25 people in the small town, a number that would increase to 12 households with nearly 50 black residents by 1880. Those African American Atlanta residents were the driving force behind planning and hosting the Grand Old-Style Barbeque of 1875. The September 22nd celebration's organizers secured permission from the Atlanta Union Central Agricultural Society to hold the event at the community's fairgrounds. Posters printed to promote the event promised that good music, good speaking, and a good time generally may be expected. Area newspapers gave the event positive advance publicity. The local newspaper, the Atlanta Argus, stated that the site chosen for the celebration is well adapted for the purpose, and all who come are promised an enjoyable occasion. Railroads that serviced it offered special round-trip fares for those area in Springfield, and Peoria. Prominent speakers were lined up for the occasion, including Shelby M. Cullom, a former congressman and a member of the Illinois House of Representatives. Cullom was a friend and political ally of Abraham Lincoln, and looking at his picture, it's not hard to see that people at the time considered him a Lincoln look-alike. Cullom was also a strong supporter of the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment that officially abolished slavery in the United States. At least 2 African-American men spoke during the barbecue. Reverend Spencer Donegan, a barber by trade, had organized the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church in 1843 in Springfield and reportedly had shaved Abraham Lincoln many times. Reverend L.A. Coleman helped to establish the Union Baptist Church in Springfield and served as the African-American congregation's pastor from 1874 to 1879. Other speakers for the 1875 event in Atlanta included the Reverend Evan Thomas, a staunch abolitionist during the Civil War and minister of the Atlanta Baptist Church. Colonel Jonathan Merriam was Atlanta's highest-ranking Civil War officer and was often asked to speak at public gatherings like Atlanta's Grand Old-Style Barbeque. The Reverend G.W. Minier made many eloquent speeches to recruit Union volunteers for the Civil War and was the minister of the Atlanta Christian Church. With the city's permission in hand, the speakers lined up and the promotional effort generating great interest, the event organizers busied themselves with last-minute preparations for the September 22nd event. Large fires were built the night before to roast beef, pork, and poultry to feed the expected crowd. Booths were set up at the fairgrounds. Local merchants stocked their shelves and swept the boardwalks in front of their stores to welcome the surge of potential customers. The city's African-American residents were busy from before dawn to after dusk, getting things ready to make sure everything was right for the momentous celebration. Then, the morning of September 22nd, cannon fire marked the start of the day-long celebration. Trains disgorged cars full of passengers who had come to Atlanta from across the region. The all-black Rogers Cornet Band of Springfield played while walking Atlanta streets, heading the procession that continued to build as they approached the fairgrounds. They were followed by a wagon containing young women representing various states. The speaker stand was crowded, and the remarks made by 15 separate speakers were well received by the enthusiastic crowd. The afternoon feast was served with what a newspaper account called an abundance of eatables. The festivities continued into the evening in Mason and Downey's Hall. A dance was held in Union Hall where one newspaper reported that the light fantastic toe was tripped. Newspaper reporters estimated the day's crowd at more than 1,000, with half being black. Although the white attendees were equal in number, the Atlanta Argus reported that most of the whites were looking on. Were they there to join their African-American fellow citizens in celebration, or did they simply want to watch the spectacle? We can't be certain. We do know that the Argus stated the whole affair was a most pleasant one, and we hope will be followed by many more like occasions. The Leader newspaper reported that the occasion was one of social enjoyment, enabling the colored people to get better acquainted with each other and will long be remembered by them. The only hiccup during the day was a brief scuffle, as reported by the Pentagraph newspaper. Nothing occurred to mar the harmony of the occasion except a remark derogatory to our lamented Lincoln, made by one Robert Copes, which was quickly resented by John Herkin, and Copes bit the dust. As the event wound down and the post-celebration cleanup began, no one knew at the time that several of the attendees would be involved in future history. September 22nd, Speaker Shelby Cullom would 2 years later become governor of Illinois and then a long-serving United States senator. Cullom would employ Monroe T. Oglesby as his personal porter and messenger. Oglesby was a member of the Rogers Cornet Band, the all-black ensemble that provided musical entertainment for the Atlanta celebration. Rogers Cornet Band also included among its members William K. Donegan, a prominent and well-respected African-American Springfield businessman who made boots for Abraham Lincoln when the future president resided in the state's capital. 36 years after the Atlanta celebration, Donegan would be murdered by an all-white mob during the infamous Springfield race riots. But all of that was yet to come. What mattered most was that Black and white citizens came together in Atlanta a decade after America's most divisive conflict and celebrated the freedom guaranteed to all citizens. It was a freedom that took the blood of a generation and the bold action of a soon-to-be martyred president to ensure it.
Congratulations,
Hi,
Heather.
Sam.
That was great. So as I was watching that, I was just struck by all the production that went into that video. What can you tell us about pulling all those images, getting the voices, getting the sound, the production team that you pulled together to make this happen?
Well, let me just say, when I had this epiphany and we started talking about it, I don't think I fully understand the scope of work that was involved, but it's a great product. So the images, so like you said, there wasn't a transcript of the event. There also were not any images taken at this event at all. So for images for the event, we did a search of many other emancipation celebrations that were happening across the country at about the same time. So we got some from the Harper's Gazette. They had the one where they had the wagon of women. So that wagon is actually in South. Like if you know the South Carolina flag, you would have known that it was in South Carolina. But it was about a similar celebration that was held about the same time in Charleston, South Carolina, and then about like the children eating food and the band and things. Those were from Austin, Texas, from the Austin History Center, from a similar event held in Austin. Actually, that was from a Juneteenth event, but it was about the same time. So we also got a lot of the images of the fairgrounds that took place from the Atlanta Public Library and Museum. They have a bunch of those there. So all those black and white images at the fairgrounds. All of those, we got images from the Library of Congress. It was a lot of searching to find images to fit what we were the story we were telling. So that was part of it. We also, to even get the research and to get all the information collected, was a collaboration. We worked a lot with the Atlanta Public Library and Museum. This story, like Looking for Lincoln, has known about for a really long time, since 2013. And there was just no way for us to tell it until we had this story mechanism. Mm-hmm. And there has been an exhibit panel in the Atlanta Museum that told the story. But it was just a little storyboard, and then that was it. And the site doesn't exist anymore. The fairgrounds have now moved down to Lincoln, so there's nothing there. It's literally, if you go to the community of Atlanta, it's a field. Like that's where this took place. So we were actually able to partner with them, and they were doing a sign on African American history in Atlanta, Illinois, and so they actually were able to embed a QR code on that exhibit that then links to this video, and they're able to use it that way. And I just want to thank real quick here the people in Atlanta that I specifically worked with on this project, because without them, this would not have happened. And that I want to thank Whitney Ortez, who helped promote the event. And we even had like a premiere showing in Atlanta, which was pretty awesome. And then Juliana Nordham at the library, who literally let me come up with my scanner and scan tons of photographs, which was a lot. I spent a day there. And then also, for Bill Thomas and Catherine Marcello, who helped with the script and actually helped get me some of the initial research. So that was very helpful with pulling this off. And one of the other things I mentioned before we start taking questions from the audience is that Because this is a story about African Americans, we felt very strongly that we needed an African American narrator to tell the story. And so Reggie Guyton, who was very involved in the Springfield local theater and works at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, did the narration for us. So, yeah.
Well, what a cool way to bring this story together, to be able to share it now with a worldwide audience, where it'll live online.
Yeah, so it's on our YouTube channel. The podcasts are available on Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, and Spotify to listen to. Obviously, a podcast is basically the video narration and sound effects without the pictures. We actually have 3 additional podcasts that we've done that we just did not have the images to tell the stories. One of the challenges of telling stories in the 19th century is there's not a lot of images. So some of the stories we'd love to tell in a video, you can't tell because it was really hard to pull the images for this one. So some of them, there was just impossible to do. But I think it's time to take questions from our audience. We actually already had one and it came in, so I was able to Google the answer. So I knew the first part, which is what was the African American population in Atlanta then and now? And so the African American population then was about 60 people, definitely under 75, and that was in the height of 1880, so right before that. And I did just Google the 2020 census, and based on the 2020 census, there is 0 African American population in Atlanta. So it seems to have peaked. I pulled up the census data, but it seems to have peaked about 1880 and then steadily decreased after that. So that was one question that was asked.
Well, I have a question for you, Heather.
Great.
So just you have this really cool mechanism in place to make videos to share your stories from the community. Do you have any other plans to make similar videos? And this topic, correct me if I'm wrong, but really came to your attention because of folks in the community. They had kept the story alive. They had done research. They were interested in telling this story. They brought it to your attention. We're able to produce the video in such a way. I'm sure other communities out there have stories like this that they would love to share with a larger audience. Are there any plans in place to do so?
Yes, and I will say Atlanta very much kept this alive. In fact, we showed a poster that would slowly scroll by in a couple of the images, and that's an actual poster that was used for the event, and that is actually at the Atlanta Museum and Library. So they definitely kept the story alive. Our next video that is currently in production is about New Philadelphia and the story of Free Frank McWhorter coming and settling and creating the first registered African American community that we know of in the United States. It's now a national landmark and is under consideration to become an actual national park. And it's located out in the western part of the heritage area in Pittsfield. So that is the next one that we're slated to do. We have a couple others in the pipeline. The next one we're releasing is going to be a podcast, but 2 other videos that we are hoping to accomplish in 2023 is the story of Father Tolton in Quincy. He was the first, he was enslaved as a child, and he fled with his mother during the Civil War to Quincy, where after the Civil War he lived, he got education there, and would eventually become the first African American priest in the country. It's a very fascinating story. He actually had to go to the Vatican to undergo his training because none of the schools in America would take him because of racism at the time. And it's a very interesting story. And most of his history takes place in Illinois. So that's one we're very eager to tell. And then the other one, which I really want to do because a lot of our communities talk about this, is the significance of the Lincoln-Douglas debates and kind of the narrative of not necessarily the speeches, but their impact on the nation as they're wrestling with the issue of slavery and and how that kind of brought Lincoln to the spotlight in the national stage, but also focus on the communities and the people in those communities that were affected. So it's not going to just be about Lincoln and Douglas. It's going to be more of a community perspective on the debates, as well as setting it in context of the national stage and launching Lincoln.
And all 7 of those debate sites are in your community, in your heritage area now, right?
Yes, they are, all 7, which is one of the reasons we want to do it. And it isn't just with that one that Lincoln and Douglas had those 7 debates. They also spoke at communities that were not official debate sites. They would speak within less than 24 hours, sometimes hours of each other. And they have stories too. And and I think this is going to be a great opportunity to highlight them. So, all right. So we have another great question. All right. So only 6 households, according to the documentary. Why was Atlanta the place where this happened? That is a great question. I'm going to try to answer it, but since I wasn't actually there at the time, this is our supposition. So Atlanta, at the time, had 2 railroads that went across the community. So it was an easy place to get to. And people, as we talked about in the video, African Americans from Bloomington and Peoria and Springfield came. Right, Rogers Cornet Band came up from Springfield for this. So they wanted someplace a lot of people could get to quickly, and Atlanta was really a central location within Illinois, or in the in this area for them to gather. That was one location. And then they already had I don't know what the impetus was of the African Americans. And I read somewhere that it was a fundraiser, but I haven't been able to track down where I read that. So we didn't put it in the video because I remember reading it, but I can't remember where I read it. So we couldn't document it. So it could have been a fundraiser. They do eventually build an African-American church in Atlanta. So it could have been for that. But those are my 2 suppositions, is that they wanted to host an event and they had a location and opportunity to do it. And they actually, we didn't put this in the video, but several of the 2 railroad lines offered discounted tickets for people to travel round trip to the event that day. So they had special service arranged for this event so that they could attract people, because a lot of people would have come to the event via the railroad. So
I would agree with that. I would probably also underscore too that Logan County is a Republican stronghold, and holding such an event, an Emancipation Day celebration event on September 22nd, don't underestimate the partisan nature of the event. It's a Republican campaign rally. Logan County, since the 1850s, is a Republican stronghold. They voted for Lincoln in both 60 and 64. During Reconstruction, throughout Reconstruction, they maintain a strong bend to the Republican Party as well. We don't know exactly who is behind the organization of the event. I would assume it was somebody that was a booster for the city of Atlanta as well.
Well, and I do know they had to get, so the Committee of African Americans that planned it had to get special permission from the fairgrounds to use it, and they had to get special permission from the sheriff. And there was a lot of steps involved. And again, I do think that there was also, maybe this was also a campaign thing, but maybe also a fundraiser as well for this group. So, all right. Okay, Sam, I have a question for you based on what you told us about the lead up for this. So the dates that you said were like August the 1st, Juneteenth, September 22nd. And did you also say January 1st, or is that one not? It is
January 1st is the date. Yeah, April 16th, add to that list. And then all those dates throughout the South that are meaningful to those folks. I didn't mention, but also add to those dates. There's other states that the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to, like the border states, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Lincoln encouraged those border states to outlaw slavery before the 13th Amendment to the Constitution became a reality. And so Maryland, in November of 1864, they outlaw slavery. That is still celebrated in their state. So add to to that list of dates, all those dates for the South that are so significant as well. But yeah, there's a whole list of dates, and kind of going through that chronology that I tried to go through really quickly sort of explains the process behind that.
And in your opinion, were the events similar? Because, you know, I know like from like the images of what they had, and like the event in Charleston, for instance, they had the parade of people representing the states, and they had speeches in the square, and they had a kind of like a big party. Is that, and when I remember when I was doing more like Emancipation Day celebrations, like in Washington, very similar. Is that kind of, do they all kind of have that same kind of feel to them?
Yeah, I mean, the script is very similar from the 1875 event, though that event that took place in 68 in Springfield. They're following the same script that was sort of outlined for the August 1st events before the Civil War, in the sense that there's a parade in town, there's music, there's a marching band, white and black folks are celebrating together. They usually go into the countryside. They listen. It's an all-day list of speakers. They eat together. There's a lunch, and a lot of times at the end of, and I think what those speakers are oftentimes talking about is sort of reviewing where we came from, be it not just the African race, but all of us. Abolitionists are heavily involved in a lot of these events as well. That road from slavery to freedom, and then not settling, not being content with just the end of slavery, but then talking about modern society and all the work that is still yet to be done to fully embrace freedom. That's a big part of a lot of these celebrations. And what I found too, in just trying to find similar events, is that oftentimes things don't just end there. Usually they go back to the city itself, like Chicago, where they'll have a major event that night. They'll have a dinner, speakers, and then a ball where people will sort of dance the night away, as we say. I see a comment, Nita Robinson says that African Americans still celebrate watch night on New Year's Eve throughout the South. That does happen, not just throughout the South, but there are events that take place all over the country, and that's where that tradition comes from. That New Year's Eve of 1863, waiting for the clock to stroke midnight, that the Emancipation Proclamation will go into effect. The next day is Lincoln going to maintain the political courage and sign that final version of the Emancipation Proclamation, which we know that he did. But it was a time for many communities to celebrate the end of slavery, even though the reality was it didn't immediately end on that date. It literally ended in large parts of this country because of the Union Army at the end of a bayonet enforcing it.
Okay, Sam, I have one last question for you. So you mentioned that a lot of, especially the celebrations related to September 22nd, have more of a political aspect of that. So, given what's going to happen when Reconstruction ends, I'm going to make an assumption. I want you to tell me if you think I'm right or wrong. Do the celebrations of the Emancipation Celebration become less political because as we move out of Reconstruction, the Republicans don't uphold the ideals of like what they had promised? Does that make sense? So is this something that becomes more of something that's celebrated for many years just by African Americans in the South or in the North as they move? Or because about the whole political aspect of it, I would think would go away with Reconstruction. Am I thinking about that in like a way that's true?
Well, I think what you did, Heather, is you outlined a really cool research project, because we know from a historical standpoint what happens after Reconstruction, after the election of 1876, the Compromise of 1877. There's a retreat from Reconstruction. Yeah. I think a lot of those Emancipation Day events that took place in the North, open air celebrations, an underlying factor, like I tried to highlight in the 68, 69 celebration, was trying to keep Republican support for Reconstruction, telling folks how important it was to ratify the 14th Amendment and stay focused that there's still so much work to be done on ratifying the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution. So what we know historically, this retreat from Reconstruction, now we can envision a research project where we would use probably newspapers, and we would try to chart, do Emancipation Day celebrations begin to wane during the Reconstruction period as the Jim Crow era enters American history. Are those Emancipation Day events sort of fading away as well as that fervor to grasp the promises of the Civil War and Reconstruction? As those fade, do those celebrations fade as well? We know they don't completely fade. They are kept alive in small pockets, particularly throughout the American South. Juneteenth is a great example of that, but there's scores of other examples, not just in the South, but also in the North. But you've outlined a really cool research project using history and looking back into the past and asking questions about public events. It's a really cool public history sort of a query, and your thesis is an interesting one.
It is, and I would be like, I would love to see what that would. So all those, history majors out there who are looking for a great thesis topic or a great research project, let me know.
Well, that's what's cool about public history and about a program like this. So keep up the great work.
Thank you. Well, everyone, we have come to the end of our time. So I want to thank you for joining us this evening, and we will see you next month. And we also want to thank Sam for coming on and helping set context to this video. So thank you so much.